fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. And I'm Al Warren. And we've got Jennifer Ann Gordon Peaches whatever today. How are you doing, Jennifer?
I'm very good. I was wondering if the Peaches was going to, if my alter ego Peaches was going to rear her peach-flavored head today.
Peach-flavored. Yeah. Well, you know, it was again.
I'm like a can of peaches, or like a. Yeah. I'm not a fresh peach.
You're not a fresh.
No, I'm like a fruit cocktail peach today, but I think that's good. I prefer it that way.
With the skin? No, I won't even go there.
No.
No, again, I was just with Golden again, and I started thinking peach, but I wasn't sure if you were up to being a peach today.
I can be a peach.
Yeah.
I can be a peach. I went to school for theater. I can inhabit my inner peach.
Yeah, so you
Peaches. Because Peaches is also, she's not just a burlesque dancer, she is also a demon.
Right.
You know? So
you gotta get control.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we don't know what Peach's real name is then.
No, nobody knows.
Demon is a secret name, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of demons, now we've got a horror writer here, and he's got a new book out. He's had some really big successes before, so we'll get him in here and talk. The new book is The Queen, a novel, and no, it's not about me. Nick Cutter, thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Nick, I'm so excited to have you here. When Al said you were coming on the show, I was like, the fangirl.
That's very kind of you, Jennifer. I appreciate it.
Jumped right on it. I'm like, I want to be the co-host for that show.
Well, I hope I won't let you down. You know,
I mean, the bar is really high now.
Right. We'll lower it immediately, and you can't be disappointed.
Well, so what got you into all this horror writing? And you've been good at it. People really are receptive to it. They respond. You do well with the writing. What was the story? Were you hurt or beat as a child? Like, what happened?
Well, yeah, many times. That probably, that's sort of, again, a separate story. No, for me, probably like a lot of maybe people you've interviewed, or people contemporaries of my generation who moved towards horror. I mean, I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, and it's the Stephen Kings are looking back at me. So I was a kid of the 80s, and at that point, I mean, King was just establishing his cultural footprint that now sort of is obviously really pervasive, and I think he's just as prolific and amazing now as he was back in the 80s. But back then, you just really couldn't walk down the street without, sort of tripping over a stack of Stephen King books. And my parents were really liberal when they weren't beating me and doing other cool things to me. And they didn't mind what I read. They had no problem if I had my nose stuck in horror books. So I started with Stephen King, and then it was, Anne Rice and Dean Koontz and Clive Barker and,
Do you remember your first Stephen King book, and how old were you?
My first, I think it was a story. I mean, the one that I remember really affecting me, the one that affected me, when I read that really affected me sort of on an emotional level, but the one that really scared me the most, I remember I was 13 years old in Calgary, where I was living at the time, and I read The Boogeyman, which is a story in his Night Shift collection. And, it was 2:00 in the afternoon in a well-lit library, and I thought, oh, that wasn't that bad. And then when my parents put me to bed at 9:30, and the shadows started crawling across my floor, I recognized that I'd made a horrible mistake. And, so I've really been, I guess I enjoy being scared. I enjoy scaring myself, and that sort of created the fundament where I sort of had this opportunity, sort of late breaking in the midst of what was a literary career at that point, to write horror. And I've been doing that for the last decade very happily.
Calgary. That would be scary. I say that as a Canadian.
Right,
so
I know. I feel like
And I'm like, Al can say that.
yeah. I enjoy Calgary. I suppose it's probably changed a little culturally since when I was there. I don't think politically I'd be aligned with its kind of aesthetic anymore. But at the time when you're a kid, you weren't aware of that necessarily. But yeah, you're right. At the time, I enjoyed it, but maybe now I wouldn't like to go back so much.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a little rough that way. Plus, not only that, it's so cold.
Oh, I see. Just on a temperature level. Yeah. Yeah, it's probably not as cold as it was back then.
No, actually, it's
Now it's probably pretty balmy.
no. Well, balmy still minus 20.
Yeah. They did have the Chinooks, though. The value of the Chinook. You'd have, 2 weeks of really pleasant weather in the middle of winter. So, but yeah. Anyways.
I just wondered, so when you take all that great horror you talked about, like King and things like that, and you grow up with that, how do you top that? Like, you know what I'm saying?
Or you don't. Al, no, as horror writers, no, you don't.
So where do you go? Like, what happens?
Well, I mean, I guess you try and join the lineage in whichever way you can. You know what I mean? You try and say what you can within the genre that you deeply enjoy. I suppose, if it were a matter of not wanting to contribute to a given genre, you would just sort of say, well, it's all been done, and the best have already spoken, had their say, and I might as well do something else with my life. So, and that'd be fine if that's ultimately what someone decided to do. I decided to wade on in there for whatever reason, and I think for a lot of creative people, because you've been so influenced, and because sort of the practitioners of the genre, not only writers, but our fellow countrymen David Cronenberg and John Carpenter, and I certainly love the cinema of fear and suspense as well. So yeah, it was more a sense of like wanting to contribute something in whichever way that I could, and having an opportunity to get my foot in the door, and then figuring out what you want to say, once you're in there. So the first book. Or the first few books, may become a little easier. And then after that, there is a sense of like, hey, I've shown you my tricks. And readers might say, well, what other tricks do you have? I'm like, well, I can juggle these balls in a slightly different way. And they're like, well, but it's still sort of the same balls, isn't it? Like, well, yes, but look, I'm wearing a mask now. So, you definitely have an issue with wanting to find things that are still creative and galvanize you and make you want to continue to keep writing. And I suppose if there's a point in which I no longer feel like writing, whether I make that decision or whether the market makes that decision, well, that's for another day. But at the moment, I'm gainfully employed, knock on wood.
Nick, like I said earlier, I'm a big fan of your work. I loved The Troop so much, and I absolutely adored the handyman method, which I thought was so fresh and strange and dark and funny. So I think you did a really great job of, I don't want to say like reinventing the juggling. I know you had a co-writer with that one too.
Yeah.
But I want to talk, what was that process like? Is that the first time you've co-written a book with somebody?
Yes, it was. I've done screenplay stuff with a co-writer, none of it particularly successfully, but that seems like often the way it is on the Hollywood side of things. You throw a lot of stuff at the wall. But I've known Andrew Sullivan, who was my co-writer, for a long time, and we just sat down in a bar and had this idea, and it started as a short story, and it moved up to what you would have read it as, Jennifer, which was sort of a short novel. And yeah, I mean, the one thing that I worry about with those sorts of things is a melding of two aesthetics, and I think me at my advanced age, I have whether you know it or not, you have a set sort of routine and aesthetic and the way that you like to carry yourself through a story. And when you're working with someone else, you want to make sure that you're honoring their own impulses on that way and allowing both of you to sort of tell the story that you want while you're also trying to fuse your styles and aesthetic into something that is readable and workable for a reader. So, I wouldn't say we had issues on that level, because we're both very, I think, agreeable Canadian gentlemen who can, sort of get along with one another. But probably because it started as something so small and grew into something so substantial, Neither of us were expecting that. So it was a great journey, frankly, together. And I do think we managed to sort of like mix two very different tonally stylistic writing styles into something that, worked for some people. You never have a book that's going to work for everybody, but I'm glad and heartened to hear you say that you enjoyed it.
I adored it. I really, really adored it.
Thank you.
So do you have, just as a horror fan, a specific trope or subgenre that you gravitate towards? Like as a fan, as a reader, and as like somebody who's watching a movie, like what's your guiltiest pleasure?
Well, I think with horror, the concern is that it is sort of a guilty genre or the maladaptives kind of gravitate towards, and I think that's something the horror has to fight sometimes, as a sort of an exterior, elitism really of other genres and people who maybe read what they would consider to be literature, not wanting to read horror because there's a thought that it is slumming but I don't know. I wouldn't say I even have a guilty pleasure because I like all of it. I will watch, sort of a A24 Robert Eggers type a movie or the literary equivalent of that. Or I'll
and then Terrifier.
Yeah, exactly. I'll watch all of that, and obviously one would sit on the lower edge of the register in terms of what would be considered prurient. But me too. Like I gravitated, especially when I was younger, towards the kind of reading material that is reflected in sort of movies like a Serbian film, or the 120 Days of Sallow, or those kind of like the ones that almost did Martyrs, that exist sort of as a dare to viewers and readers. And I guess maybe time sort of erases some of that in me. I wouldn't necessarily seek those things out with the sort of gleeful hope of being shocked that I used to be.
Well, because now nothing is shocking.
It's harder, isn't it? Yeah. It's harder to be scared, even that, right? Like you can definitely be grossed out, I think. You can definitely have movies that are going to, or books that are really going to push you to places. But almost they're doing it, I think, so aggressively that it's maybe a little transparent. And maybe people could even think that fairly of some of my work, too. But anyways, yeah, I'm not sure I have to have a guilty pleasure, Jennifer, simply because I like all of it, really. I can see value in every single kind of horror that's out there. And I think one of I wouldn't say a problem, because it's too big to say that, but I think one of the issues that sometimes faces the horror genre lately is that there is that kind of, like I came from a literary background, and the literary world is, there is elitism. There is a sense of like, this is the sort of stuff that we should be reading, almost like it's good medicine to be taken. And you think coming into my first love, horror, that you would find that because it's a malign genre from the outside, that there would be none of that, and then you come in and you realize, there is, with this notion of elevated horror, and there are certain almost gatekeepers who, not that they're individuals necessarily, but more like just sort of thoughts that sort of are exclusionary even within the genre, and I'm not sure that that's really all that valuable.
No, I don't think it is either. And I know I've gotten that a little bit even with my work, like people saying like, oh, just because there's a ghost doesn't make it horror. It wasn't scary, it was blah, it was this. And then I have other people say, this wasn't horror, it was literary. And literary people going, this wasn't literary, it was horror. And I'm like, what if it's all of it?
And the like very arbitrary, right? And you're certainly not sitting down, nor am I, sort of asking ourselves where this places within these sort of almost arbitrary structures. But without knowing that, you still face sort of commentary. And, I think you and I, facing, that's part of the job, right? So it's not like you can avoid it, and nor should you. But some of it is I just don't employ it myself. When I read a book, I don't sort of put up those walls or barriers towards my enjoyment of it.
Does that affect the way you write a book? But like when you're doing a story, you're sitting down, your new book, The Queen, for instance. So you're sitting there and you're putting this together.
Yeah.
Are you conscious or thinking about the audience or about the horror community and all the other stuff going on out there? Does it get involved in your mind?
No, not in the writing of it. I mean, you might think after it's done and the book is getting ready to be published, you sort of have this sense of how it might be received. But while I'm writing, and maybe Jennifer's the same this way, I would hope so, is, no, you're taken up with the story, and you're taken up with the characters, and you're taken up, with the idea that you've come up with, and hopefully taking any level of joy that you can from that process, I would say. I guess after 20 years, I recognize that there is a system that it will be released into, that will be, and that readers and the outer world will eventually have their say on it, and their say ultimately is more important than my say, because my belief is once you release a book, it doesn't really belong to you anymore. But while you're gestating it and while you're working on it, it still is sort of yours. And you call the shots with it, and you get to sort of like navigate your way through the way that you want to tell it. And then I think if those thoughts are creeping in, I'm not saying that they don't ever, Alan, I'm sure they must at some point from time to time, but generally, they tend not to have any kind of impact. Those are things that sort of the cart after the horse, and you realize once it's out the way that it's received. But that, nor does that bother me when I'm going through the publication process, and it doesn't carry into my next book. At least it hasn't to this point, and I certainly hope it won't in future.
But, sounding like a rational Canadian person that you are,
Right.
Do you experience your characters on a personal level? Like, do you have a relationship with them? Do you kind of have an experience? And do you consider them sort of like real people?
I think I couldn't, because I do some awful things to represent some things.
Well, that doesn't mean you couldn't.
I mean,
that's why he has two pen names. Nick Cutter doesn't care about his characters, but
no, that's not a factor of the writing necessarily. But I do, Alan, to answer your question, I think honestly, I do need to feel that they're infused with a certain narrative or sort of lifeblood of their own. I think in the best instances, at some point in the narrative, they start walking around and talking on their own almost. They've kind of, I know that maybe sounds a little cliche, or even like, come on, you can't mean that. And maybe I don't mean it exactly, but there are points when you're really in the, you've worked yourself into a groove with it, or sometimes that just happens organically and you're just fortunate to be able to ride that kind of current that a given book has created, and they don't all do that. Where they seem more alive, and it feels like, you almost know the interactions, and you can sort of picture the characters sort of ping-ponging off each other, or their own internal monologues that they're having, and they feel very unique to that character, but that it's, that's not, I've never had a character that starts page one like that I sort of know inside out. It's more, for me anyways, it's a process of learning them as they go along. And if you're lucky by, sort of the midpoint of the book, you have an established understanding of who they are and what they might do. And that helps guide the plot sometimes in some really interesting directions. And then on an edit, you can sort of take that sense of who those characters are and backfill during the early portion of the book to sort of bring the characters up to speed so they feel, harmonized all the way through. But as do I inhabit their mindscape in that really close way? I think some authors do. I don't doubt that if that's what authors have said to you before. But I would be lying if I said that I get quite that close. And that's not only because I'm going to do something terrible to them. I think if one of the hallmarks of horror is if you don't care about a character as a reader, you're probably not going to care what happens to them. So I feel like I need to care about those characters as well, even if ultimately their ends are going to be pretty grim.
Well, and we talk about, so your character like Margaret Carpenter in this new book, The Queen. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the situation. What have you written here in Queen? What are people going to get?
Well, I mean, without giving too much away, I mean,
yeah, we want the ending.
Can you just spoil the ending?
Yeah, I feel like with this one, it's a teenage narrative, a teenage narrator primarily. That's the predominant sort of writing voice, and a first person, which I haven't done in a Nick Cutter book, I don't believe. nor have I written a female narrator before. So it was like a landmine that you knew you were going into the narrative with that strapped on your chest right away. But what I really was interested in, I've written about teenagers before, and I think I like that time in a person's life. I feel like it's just a time of, I think, great discovery and great volatility. And I was really intrigued by this notion, and maybe you, Alan, or Jennifer's have had this as well, is, the summer of your 18th or 19th year. 19 for me, because I had grade 13 in Ontario. We were the generation of lunkheads who they thought, well, they better give an extra grade to these guys. They're
not finished baking yet.
They have not
come back in the
underneath their mother's wing yet, and they're still thick.
They're a little doozy.
And it didn't work.
They've gotten rid of it, exactly. But such was the idea back in the mid-'90s when I was in high school. And some of us went away to university, including myself, and some of us stayed in the hometown that I essentially grew up in and where most of my writing takes place. And, we said the same things that I'm sure people for time immemorial have said in that instance, is that we will stay in touch. I'll call every day. I'll come back on weekends. Like, fundamentally, nothing will change. We will be friends forever because we've been friends forever. And then slyly, in the way that distance tends to do those things, these two people get pulled apart, they drift apart. And there's some level of guilt, and there's some level of recrimination, and there's some level of mystification that people who have been so close for all their life and had no reason to believe that they wouldn't continue to be the best of friends, you run into them on the street 3-4 years later, and it's like two strangers meeting. But it's worse because it's not like two strangers. It's two people who were like as close could be, and now they are estranged. So I remember that, and I remember those feelings, and as an adult, you see the necessity of that. It's a part of life. But at the time, I think there was a great deal of emotions wrapped up in that. So with most of these horror books, outside of the gooey, gory sort of stuff that is kind of a hallmark of the books, and which I really enjoy writing, I want to latch on to certain fundamental aspects even of my own life that feel important and investigate those while, doing the other stuff, which, again, I enjoy doing very much. But if you're asking for what is sort of the spine, character narrative spine, it's that relationship between two characters, specifically at that point in their lives.
Right, but when you are so involved in that sort of thing, and I do that with some of my writing at times when I'm involved, it can be emotional in a sense, right? Because you have to really get into your character in order to make it sound real and have the real emotions and things come out on the page of what they're experiencing. So going through all that stuff, at the end of something like a book like this, it must change you then. You must get some sort of difference happens because you explore your own feelings as well, how they relate.
Yeah, like a little catharsis even, maybe, or some kind of a new way of looking at your own past. I think that's true. And I can't say that that's not a portion of what draws me probably back to writing. And maybe from the start, it's a way of investigating your own past and putting sort of fictional prisms against your own lived experience and refracting it, and seeing what comes back and replaying it and asking yourself certain questions about it. And then at the end of my wife will every so often come in and find me, I like laugh. Sometimes she'll hear me laughing hysterically up in my writing chamber, and I'm sure she looks up sort of with like just a vaguely disgusted look, like, oh, I bet she's just doing something revolting up there right now, and he's enjoying the hell out of himself. But there's other times where she'll find me, like almost openly weeping, frankly, you know what I mean? And that's a good thing. I feel like, okay, I'm there with this story for this scene, and it's affecting me at some level. And that's usually a decent harbinger for the scene is working. You find out later that whatever emotions that are bringing me to that place have been transmitted, at least in part, into the book itself, into that scene, and ideally are hitting readers obviously they can't feel the full brunt of my own experience. But, you know, as writers ourselves, I think there's some part of like trying to find the universal in certain experiences. Something that I felt that I assume my reader is going to feel, and you're sort of reaching out to see if there's that synchronicity between those experiences. So I think you're completely right, Alan, in that you probably do. Any writer comes out of their books changed at some level from the experience of writing it.
Was your approach to this main character in The Queen, you said you're writing first person and it's a teenage girl. How did you approach that character, and was the process different than when you're writing a character that you can, who is male, or, like, how much did you have to do research? Did you feel creepy doing that research?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I use that landmine analogy, and I suppose that works. I think we know, for writing as long as we have, like, some some books are going to have almost immediately they present themselves at the level of the idea as like, well, how are you going to manage this? And if you do, it's going to be a bigger challenge than, say, this other idea over here. But if the idea that's really pushing you is that powerful, then probably the need is going to be to sort of investigate it despite its bigger challenges. So yeah, I mean, I've written, again, teenage male narrators quite a bit, and teenage female characters, but never from a first person perspective. And it was nerve-wracking, but again, I think what I tried to do is, as I said before, is focus on the universal. Is there certain events like the one I described about leaving or staying that feel like genderless? It's something that could happen to anybody, really, any human being. So and I did as best I could focus on that. I mean, there's a scene midway through which, it's a sex scene essentially, like first time and like that was nerve-wracking, but it also, hopefully it doesn't feel gratuitous. And really what I did, Jennifer, is I focused on my own first time, like, how did I feel? Well, it didn't quite measure up to all ways that I thought it might have gone, and I thought I was letting my partner down. And I'd watched some movies, and back in the 80s it was, Kenny G was blowing on a saxophone, and there was mosquito netting blowing around a bed, and two bodies were moving in like fluid motion with each other, and that was not how.
And that was not your experience.
No, that was not my experience, nor was it my partner's. And I was embarrassed about the way my body might have looked suddenly. And so, yes, that was me. But I had to hope, I guess, at some weird level, that also is a universal experience for a lot of us, is that it's not what we thought it would be. And it's not as romantic, and it's something in a weird way to have to get through. And you hope you're doing it with someone who cares about you and you care about them, and maybe that's enough for the first time, you know what I mean? So yeah, it was a lot of that. It was a lot of just trying to focus on things that felt like, as best as I could, part of the teenage experience, and avoiding the things that felt specifically female that I would not really be able to comment on with any kind of accuracy. And you can get through a novel that way, I discovered, is just.
Oh no, you definitely can.
Yeah,
like I've written things from the male perspective, and I'm like, okay, it's just universal, human experience.
I guess, exactly.
Loss, love, awkwardness.
Yeah, friendship, trials of friendship, and sometimes like it's a very selfish time in your life, and it's a very self-involved time in your life, and there's certainly things about that time in my life that when I think about them, I don't come off well as a thinking, emotive, empathetic human being. But I have two kids myself, and I'm going to watch them go through teenagehood, and I'm sure that they will come away with things that they're regretful about, so. Which makes it an interesting time to look at narratively when you're writing a book.
Violence is this violent? Do you put a lot of graphic, let's say, action in the stories?
Yeah, I feel like that's part and parcel of. I mean, that even with my books under my own name, yes. I mean, I remember, you guys would both know, my first review I ever got for my first book, I was, I think, 29, and it was Publishers Weekly, which, as we know, the pre-pub ones, and the first professional review I got. And the last sentence was something like, Craig Davidson is a clever and able wordsmith, or something along those lines. But some readers will not be able to appreciate his obvious gifts because of his frequent focus on gore. I thought that's fair. And that actually, 20 years ago, basically to now, has proved to be more or less accurate. You know what I mean?
See, I would read that review and go, oh, I will pick up that book.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, it's like, now it's become like, that's a you problem, not a me problem. Like, if you can't see what the other things that I'm trying to do, and you are too taken with, or, making muees of disgust at some of the other stuff that's going on, I mean, then that's, I'm not going to change. Like, I've been doing this for 20 years. Things are going basically fine, and I'm doing it the way that I want to do it, which we all know that writing is like, it's not brain surgery, it's not the hardest thing in the world, but like, it's not, if you're not doing it truthfully to yourself and the way that you want to do it, then there are many other things out there that you could probably be turning your hand to that would give you more joy. So yeah, it's like, this is how I'm going to tell my stories. This is how I feel like I tell my stories best. And if you are missing the things that I'm saying that are, I think, more profound and speak to a greater sense of what the human experience is all about because you're fixated on these things, then that's on you. That's not really on me.
Well, there you go. Don't like it, don't buy it. Is that it?
That's how it, isn't it always? Huh? Caveat emptor, buyer beware, and buy if you like it, and if not, then, there's plenty of other writers who are going to scratch your itch.
Ooh, now I'm excited.
Ooh.
So listen, the Queen. What is there a subtext here? Do you ever have meaning in your stories, or even if it develops organically? I mean, you might not sit down and go, well, this is an important issue and get it involved, but does maybe something come out of it, and you hope people kind of pick up how you've written the book?
Yeah,
like a subtext.
I think horror, has a great facility really to comment on things in society. Like, obliquely, sort of. It doesn't necessarily need to come out and be really heavy-handed about it. I think that's maybe more of a hallmark sometimes of literary fiction. Not all of it. Some literary fiction is very, sort of clever and subtle about the way that it comments on the world. But I mean, yeah, there's things here about. I talked about Calgary, but I live in Toronto now. But the book takes place in St. Catharines, and Alan, you may or may not remember, but back in the 90s, and Jennifer, you maybe too. But there was in my hometown of St. Catharines, there was a serial killer named Paul Bernardo, who killed two young girls, Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, and I was in maybe grade 13 at the time, or grade 12, and I remember I was a rower, a poor rower, but we have a rowing regatta down on the Henley Waterway, and the police came, and they took all of us rowers, and they had us like hunting through the bushes, and we didn't know what we were doing until afterwards. It was clear we were looking for Kristen French's body, which none of us found, thank goodness. But what I remember of that time, and this is an important part, I think, of memory, and this is 30 years later, but what I set out to write this book under was this feeling that of the two, one of them was memorialized differently than the other. One of them was memorialized sort of in a more exalted way than the other. And everybody had a story about Kristen French. Everybody spoke lovingly and well of Kristen French. And it's not that anyone spoke badly about Leslie Mahaffey, it's just like they didn't speak as much. And in my view, it was because Kristen came from a good, wealthy family. And because Leslie came from a family of lessened means. And while I think in my research after the fact has proven, at least to me, that maybe that wasn't so much the case as I had thought in going into the writing of this, I do think, sadly, that the idea that more efforts are taken for someone who goes missing from a rich family than from a family of lesser means. Like, my family and I live in a modest, middle-class enclave, but I know if one of our children went missing, the outpouring from police and from the community would be swift and declarative. And I know that if a child went missing on the Bridle Path, which is our city's richest neighborhood, the outpouring would be even swifter and even more voluminous. But I wonder, and I'm concerned, and I feel that it's simply a sad truism, that if a child went missing from one of our lower income neighborhoods, that the outpouring of effort would be significantly less. So that was one thing that the book was looking at and investigating from my own perspective, but also seeing sort of how those cases sometimes get handled in a big city like Toronto.
Okay, so let's talk about how people can find you. So do you have social media, a website, lemonade stand? Where do people find?
Lemonade
It's a megaphone.
is in process. Going to
Yeah.
dragoon my kids to staff a lemonade stand at all times out front, day or night.
That works. Hey,
No, Alan, I cannot be. I do not have it online. I don't have social media. I discovered long ago that that's just really not the thing for me. But I do have a website, www.craigdavidson.net, and my own brother, who is his career is as a computer website designer. He's made a really cool website specifically for the Queen, which you can access off that website, and it's sort of like full of Easter eggs and cool content that would be especially of interest after you've read the book, but even not having read the book would probably be sort of fun to trip your eyes over.
Oh, there you go. We'll put all that up on our website as well,
Thank
so
you.
people can find you easily and stuff. So you got something big planned next? Do you this
Other than the
book's out?
lemonade stand?
Yeah, like what
I'm not-
happens to
That's the retirement plan.
Yeah, like you've got the book out, so you promote it and all that, or do you have other books you're working on now, or are you just doing the lemonade thing?
Well, I mean, that's a sideline, and we're hoping that's going to get big. It's going to depend on the strong backs of my children, but I'm hoping. But otherwise I've got 2 books still under contract for Cutter, so they should come out within the next couple years. I just turned in, actually, today, the rough draft of my next book. And under my own name, I've got a book also under contract, which I finished not long ago. So it could be, 2025 could be a pretty busy year. I certainly hope so.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, we appreciate you being here, and we learned a lot, about lemonade and.
Yeah, and like, you really lit up when we started talking about the lemonade
Oh,
stand.
you guys are
You were like,
speaking my language.
he's like, oh my gosh, I could have had a lemonade stand the whole time?
That's the name of the next book.
You wouldn't have got me to stop.
The next book is called The Lemonade Stand.
The lemonade stand. There you go.
The haunted lemonades.
The Haunted Lemonade Stand.
Yeah, and the girl that works
Peaches
there.
works there.
Peaches, yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, we could co-write one, Jennifer. Yeah.
Oh, we do. It can start as a short story, and then it can just get completely screwed up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As it should.
All right, well, we got a plan.
Well, again, thank you, Nick Cutter.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.